Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to Fired Up. My name is Morgan McClintic, and today we're going to be talking all about how to pitch the media. There's a lot of AI founders who are first-time founders out there at the moment who maybe want to do this themselves or will be working with an agency to help craft that pitch. So what we thought we'd do is just unpack what is a media pitch, how does media coverage come about, what makes a great pitch. And so to do that, I am joined by Chris Ulbrich, and we'll be unpacking it today. Hey, Chris, how are you?
Hey, doing great. Pleased to be here as always.
Right. Let's just start here about what is a media pitch?
Well, a media pitch is an offer of something that you think is of interest to a reporter. It could range from an anonymous tip to a full-blown feature package where you are offering the reporter interviews with stakeholders and customers and a tour of your factory or facility, along with some kind of sense of what the reporter's story could be. So they can be quite detailed, or they can be a one-liner. It's an interaction with a reporter where you're offering something that you think will be of use to the journalist in their job.
Okay, so what's the difference between that and a press release?
Yeah, that is one of the key initial questions when you're starting to work with PR. That's one of the first things that you deal with, because a lot of the more traditional PR firms and some of these fly-by-night agencies will try to convince founders that a press release is all it takes to get coverage and that the pitch is more or less identical to the press release. So they'll say, we can distribute your press release with all of these different audiences and win you coverage in such and such publication. Now, there's a whole separate show to be done on press releases. And I know we've touched on the topic in the past, but on wire releases, I mean, and distribution and so on. But just to say, that's not the way it works. A press release is the document you put together to encapsulate the most important facts about the news that you're announcing. And typically, the press release is going to serve multiple audiences. In theory, back in the day, a press release was actually intended to be slotted directly into a newspaper. So press releases were written like news stories. But these days, they are treated like marketing material. You will have lots of stakeholders typically involved in their production, the product people, the marketing people, sometimes investors, and often you're speaking to multiple audiences. Yes, the press release needs to be of use to the media. Ideally, that is still its primary audience. But in practice, a lot of the time, because there are so many cooks in the press release kitchen, and because the press release plays such an important role these days with the sales motion, sometimes the most important audience for a press release is the customer audience, and the channel for it is through the salespeople. Sometimes salespeople, the sales team, are the ones pushing hardest for the press release because they want a document that they can share with the customers to show continued momentum, to indicate the details of a new product and kick off or continue a conversation. At the same time, it does need to be comprehensible to the media. So there's a push and pull that goes on in press releases that means that they are not necessarily the best vehicle to communicate with the press. They are an important component of your press outreach, but the pitch is where you make your case to the reporter in the terms that is most likely to land with the reporter. A pitch is the news described in a way that is most appealing to a journalist. So it's going to be shorter, it's going to be less self-interested, meaning you're going to talk more about trends and how this news speaks to other things that the reporter is covering than all of the details in the press release that are probably going to be like product details and whatnot that are probably going to be of more interest to potential buyers of the product. That is sort of useful background as needed for the reporter, but it's usually not unless you're doing a product pitch for, say, a new motorcycle, a new printer, something that's just clearly you're pitching product news to product reporters. Most of the time, the product details are more for other audiences than the media.
Right. And so I think for early stage founders, it might surprise you to know that, okay, I've issued a press release. The reporters are not then just picking up, maybe even put it over the news wire, picking up the news from the press release. And in fact, that most detailed coverage of startups comes from pitching the media proactively, unless you've actually reached out to that reporter with this news. They've got plenty of other things to write about, and you've got to fight for their attention with your pitch. And, it's that outbound motion of the pitch that's going to get their attention for your news and help them prioritize this story over your competitors who are also announcing things. So let's talk about how startups should sort of think about news value. What makes a story worth pitching?
Right. And again, really critical consideration when you are first getting into PR, because a lot of the time in a small company, the founder is the lead salesperson, the lead marketer, sometimes the lead product person. They're wearing lots of hats, right? They're definitely the person that's out there making the case to investors, right? So they're used to describing the product and the company in ways that appeal to those audiences. And it's natural for them to fall back on that language and that structure, which isn't necessarily the structure that works best for reporters. The overarching principle of news reporting is that news is new. A good story, or a story that is typically told in the news, is one that is actually less valuable or less worthy of publication the longer time goes on. If the story is as good next week as it was last week, that's not to sometimes there are stories like that get published, like investigative reporting would fall into that category, but most news does depend on timeliness. So one of the most important lessons for someone just getting into PR is that when you are trying to get the attention of the media, you have to create what's known as a news hook. You have to create a timely reason for the reporter to cover. Now, in business to business tech, that tends to be some kind of product launch. The bad news there is that there are fewer reporters out there covering product launches for a variety of reasons. Some of it due to the adoption of SaaS, where one version of the product bleeds into the other. And there aren't the sort of sharp distinctions between versions that there used to be. Reporters sort of gotten out of the habit of that. But one of the biggest challenges of a PR campaign is figuring out how to make your story timely, how to create a moment, a news moment that makes you worth talking about right now. I remember before I got into PR, I would just sort of absorb journalism, and I wouldn't really think too much about why such and such celebrity was on the late night shows or why they were on the cover of Vanity Fair. It seemed to me that, oh, well, they're just interesting people. They are people with celebrity, so they have their turn on the cover. Of course, that's ridiculous. And of course, I knew they were promoting a movie or a new book or a new government initiative or something. But it hadn't occurred to me that that is actually the key, that it was the timely hook that made the entire story in most cases. The same principle applies all the way down to the most modest news story. You have to be timely in some way, and figuring out how to do that is one of the biggest challenges of a B2B campaign.
Right. And, you've got some fundamental elements of news and oddity and celebrity and, is it interesting to sort of humans, and is there conflict, and does it affect your local community proximity, or how many people does it impact? Like, the more of these kind of components that you can wrap into your press release, but also your pitch, that makes it more newsworthy. So those are sort of the classic things that we'll look for. And I think that's important for a startup because obviously, hey, I'm launching my new product. This is internally, this is really important. This is big news for us because we're launching our new product. We've been working on it for it. It's going to open up all this new revenue opportunities. We're going to help our customers. Like, this is a big deal. But for the rest of the world, is it odd? Does it involve celebrity? How much impact does it have? All of those. You've got to ladder up to those elements to make it relevant outside of your audience. And I think that's often some of the tension or where companies sort of can go wrong because, sure, this is a big deal for us, but why is it a big deal for the journalists' readers? You have to explain that.
That's exactly it. And it really does depend. So much of the deliberation there has to do with the reporters that you are trying to pitch because everyone has different needs and they're serving different audiences or they're writing for different audiences. So that all goes into the consideration set.
Right. So we got our announcement. We've drafted our press release. We're going to write a pitch. Just tell me, like, what are the components of that pitch? Is it like, this is an email, right?
Yeah, most of the time it's an email. I think we'll probably say more on this in a bit. I have a feeling we'll have more to say about reporters themselves because it's hard to talk about pitching without talking about reporters. But most reporters still prefer to be pitched by email because they get so many offers. And it's even worse these days because of AI. So they were getting bombarded by PR people even before the emergence of generative AI. Now with generative AI, it's getting completely out of hand. So one of the reasons I think journalists prefer pitches to come in over email is that they can set up filters that make their inbox manageable. They can take a look at the slush pile of incoming offers. And, tied to that, and I don't think this will surprise any of our younger listeners, there's just been a sort of generational shift away from synchronous phone conversation in general. Now, some reporters, once you've established a relationship with them, they'll be open to getting a text from you. And if you are dropping like a really sensitive tip, then reporters will also usually publish their Signal, which is an encrypted chat app. It's not the place to drop your latest product announcement, but if you have some industry information that you want to provide on an anonymous basis, the Signal would probably be the best place to do it. You'll probably get a good response there. But in general, the bread and butter of a pitch program is an email.
Right. And so talk us through the sort of components of that. What does it look like? How long is it?
So again, you're trying to be of service to a reporter. So the reporter's preferences are paramount. And luckily, the guidance that just about every reporter will give, and I mean, this is based on reading probably hundreds of comments from reporters over the years. They all want the pitch to be short. So make it concise, right? And we're talking maybe 4 or 5 lines for the core of the pitch, right? What you'll often hear is if you can't make your case in 2, 3, maybe 4 lines, you've lost me, done, right? So clarity and concision are the most important. Be clear, be short. And that starts with the subject line. Everybody has their own philosophy about this. It's one of the things that distinguishes one PR professional from another. My point of view is you want to be upfront with the reporter. You want them to understand as soon as possible what it is you're offering and what category of offer you're making and the essence of the news within the first 2, 3 lines, including the subject line. So typically in a subject line, if it's product news, I will flag it as news. If it is a tip, I will say capital TIP : if you're offering the news as an exclusive, which practically guarantees that you'll get some response from the reporter. Reporters understand if you're offering news as an exclusive, as long as it's reasonably within their coverage area, they'll usually do you the courtesy of a response because they know you're holding the news just for them. So if it's an exclusive, lead with that. And then 6, 7 words about the company involved or the kind of news it is. The purpose of a subject line is to stand out in the reporter's email box, get them to open the email without misleading. You don't want to pull a bait and switch, right? You don't want to attract attention at all costs because you're hoping to have a relationship with the reporter down the line, and trust is fundamental to any long-term media relationship. So you've written your punchy, concise subject line. You lay out in a couple of lines what's new, what's timely about the news, why it's important, why it's significant, and when it's happening. If it's in the future, sometimes you are pitching news under embargo, meaning that you are agreeing with the reporter to provide news that will not be published until a certain day and time. This is a little tricky, and one of the reasons that founders work with agencies, because an embargo is, you could think of it as a contract, an agreement, but you are setting up an agreement with lots of reporters that they're all going to hold the news. So you have to be sure that they are reputable enough to hold the news that long and that they'll understand the whole process. Like a blogger might not even exactly know what an embargo is. And so you have to be sort of cautious. Sometimes if you pick the wrong people to hold the news, they'll publish it early or they'll publish it not at all. And it's a bit of a mess. Well, publishing it not at all is their option. Publishing it early would break the contract. And then you're on the hook with all the other reporters who are also under embargo, and they think you've given the one reporter
preference,
and it's a whole mess. But part of what you're communicating in the email is this coming later, or has it already happened? Did it happen today? And if you're pitching under embargo, it's like, again, that's a whole other subject that you should probably, before taking that on yourself, get some advice from your favorite PR consultant.
So the pitch is not all the details of my announcement. I'm sort of choosing specific bits that are the most newsworthy, and we just talked about what makes it news. And it's not the same for all the reporters. It's not just like, okay, this is just an email blast and I just load it up and here's my pitch. No. It's short. It's met all the criteria you just talked about. And here's my media list. I'm just going to email it out to everyone. You're tailoring this to each individual reporter based on their beat and what they think might be interesting. And that's really the art of it, I guess.
It is the art of it. It's a kind of mass personalization because you do need to contact often lots of reporters about the news. But in the best version of that outreach, you are tailoring your email, your communication, to the interests, the needs of each reporter, and also putting it in the context of hopefully the ongoing of previous news you've sent them. So there's some customization going on. The essence of the news needs to be expressed in short, clear, concise sentences at the top. But sometimes it does make sense to provide key points of the news down below for reference. So I don't think of that as the core of the pitch, but just because the pitch is short doesn't mean that the email can't have reference material below. That sometimes the easiest way to do it is just to paste in the press release. But a lot of times the press release is not the best vehicle. It doesn't highlight necessarily the key points that are going to be most interesting to a reporter. So a lot of times I'll reformat in terms that are going to be most helpful to the reporter as opposed to the many audiences that are consuming a press release. So they'll get the pitch at the top, they'll get supporting details below for their reference should they care for it to read it. And then we'll also point, if the news is published, we'll provide a link to the published press release either on the company's blog or on their newswire, wherever they've published it. So the reporter has multiple sources of information to decide whether it's something they want to cover. And if it is, gives them at least a good starting point for framing out their story.
Right. And by the way, this is sort of why if you have an agency and, sometimes clients will say, I want to see the pitch. And, agencies will go, okay, well, I can give you the sort of main beats of what I'm saying, but I'm not going to give you verbatim the email because it's, that's just an email between our ongoing relationship with this reporter and I'm sort of tailoring it to each, but it's different. There isn't one. And the things we highlight to get their attention might not be the things that a marketer would want to say to their buyers. And you just want unpacking all that just takes a lot of time. Okay, so we know what our news is. We know what our pitch is. We're going to pitch by email and we've got our sort of subject and hook and all that data. Now I need to know who to pitch it to, what's the process to identify the right journalists?
And so similarly to how just about every journalist will say, keep your pitch short. Just about every journalist will say that the biggest frustration for me is how many pitches I get that are totally irrelevant to what I cover. The main consideration when deciding who to pitch your news to is whether you have evidence that this news is like things they've covered in the past.
Yes.
Is it something that they get paid to cover? Most reporters are, especially in the tech world, they're assigned fairly narrow beats. Some reporters, 99% of the time, their job is to cover big tech, Apple, AMD, Intel, Nvidia, Meta. They don't cover startups, except insofar as those startups intersect with those big companies. Sometimes companies just cover Apple. There are reporters out there who really just cover the big AI companies like OpenAI, Anthropic. That's their job, just to cover the beats of the competition and the innovation at those companies. You're just not going to get anywhere trying to pitch a B2B company that isn't one of those giants to a reporter whose job it is to cover the giants. Now, this is where another aspect to the art of a successful PR campaign. Right now, for instance, the news is about OpenAI potentially encroaching on B2B SaaS software, right? Yeah. Maybe creating applications GPT based on ChatGPT. Now, if you're in a sector that it looks like ChatGPT might move into, it's not out of the question that a reporter who covers OpenAI might want to talk to you to get your take on how it's affecting your strategy, how worried you are about it. Of course, most companies are going to say, well, it validates what we're doing and it's all that we're focused on. So we feel like we have the advantage no matter what. We're developing our own AI and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the reporter probably knows what you're going to say, but they may need that perspective in their story. So that is conceivably a way in with that reporter, but you have to know why you're approaching the OpenAI reporter if you're not OpenAI.
Yeah. And, this isn't just about sort of, well, at least I got an impression in their inbox and that my name is out there, even if it wasn't relevant. You're not really currying any favors there. You're just clogging up the works, and at best, you're going to be ignored. And at worst, you can get blacklisted if you keep doing it for that reporter who might actually be critical to you or even whole publications. And so I feel like this, can be approach with care. And right. Sometimes you see, reporters lose their sense of humor about it, and they'll publicly post about a particular pitch and how it went wrong. And you don't want to be on the receiving end of that.
I mean, seriously, doing PR day to day, it's like having two little imps on your shoulder, or, an angel on your shoulder. And the angel is saying, only pitch what a reporter wants to hear about. And the other one is saying, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yeah.
And striking the balance between those two is harder than it might seem, because sometimes, look, I've worked with PR people whose imp was very loud, and a lot of times they ticked off reporters. Once in a while, they hit a crazy pitch. Like they swung overhand at a fastball that was above their head and knocked it out of the park. It happens, but you're always playing the percentages in this job.
That's right. So, if I want to build up my list of who to pitch, there are databases. Muckrack is one of them. It's one that we use. It's probably the best updated. It's also very expensive. Is this something that a startup directly, obviously an agency is going to have something, but is this something that a startup should buy themselves, or should they just manually build a list?
Well, I don't get the bill and you do. So it is a cost-benefit analysis. I'd be sort of interested in what you think, because I'm only dimly aware of what it all costs. I will say, for an agency, a tool like Muckrack is essential. I don't know how you do the job without it anymore. These tools aren't just directories of reporters, and they don't just keep track of where they're working, the best email address to reach them, but also what they have covered recently. That was the big innovation with the current generation of tools, actually connecting reporters with their coverage. And that is a huge advantage if you're trying to build a media list. And so it's useful for anyone, whether you're a PR professional or not, would be glad to have a tool like that, but they can be pricey.
Yeah. And I think depends how much news you're going to be doing. It depends how big your media sphere might be. You know, if you're in semiconductors and you're mainly talking to semiconductor publications, there's 5 publications that are going to write about them, plus a handful of people that cover at the top end. You can probably find them by looking at who's covered your competitors and the other titans in your industry. You probably get to know them pretty quickly. You know, other companies, horizontal AI company could have hundreds of reporters. So it will kind of depend. But, you know, there are plenty of databases out there and they have email engines on them and they have a whole bunch of bloat that you probably don't need. Even an agency like us doesn't need.
Definitely don't recommend the tools for mass emailing that come in some of those products.
And they're doing AI to generate the press release. It's just a lot of software bloat. But the data is very good. All right, let's talk about the actual sort of how to pitch the channel. Back in the day, we used to call reporters and they used to slam down the phone and sometimes you get them on the plane and they used to be rude and all that kind of stuff. You toughen up a little bit and, you know, and it was fun. But those days of long, like, you know, so I still hear, well, you know, when you're talking to your reporter friends, maybe you could just drop our name in. And the reality is talking to reporter friends about, i.e. pitching over the phone to reporters, that is a tiny fraction of outbound. Most of it's email, but it's also, what about DMs and LinkedIn and other channels?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, the phone is pretty well out of favor. Although it's funny, I did see someone recently, a reporter, give some helpful guidance about the best way to contact them. And they said, phone is better than email, which is better than DM. And this person said, I just love to chat. I won't bite. Don't worry about calling me. And that is a real rarity. I find it's more common among reporters from an older generation who are just, you know, more used to working on the phone. I think there's still more of a phone culture in the UK. So reporters who've come over from the UK will, I think, be more open to it. But in general, calling cold is a great way to get blacklisted. So even if, say you've met a reporter at a conference and you've exchanged numbers, a lot of times reporters are happier to be connected to executives than they are to PR people because they figure that the executive is probably going to be a more valuable contact. And on top of that, they're not going to be badgering them all the time with irrelevant pitches. If you do want to like have a quick conversation and you have the reporter's contact, I would only do it if you've met them before. I would text them first. You know, don't just call out of nowhere. Hey, could I just run you through this news, see if it might be of interest to you? A lot of times reporters will be open to that if you've sort of established, if you have that initial connection with them. So even reporters who don't love or just actively hate cold calls, which is most of them in my experience, they might be open to a short chat if you've given them a heads up on text first. As I mentioned earlier, Signal is usually the place to do tips. More and more reporters are using LinkedIn to publish calls for sources where they say, I'm working on such and such a story, and I really need some input from such and such an expert. Hit me up on DM on LinkedIn if you know anyone. But I think LinkedIn's becoming a little more important in the B2B tech world, especially for working with reporters. If you have a really strong relationship with a reporter, then I think a lot of work does get done in DMs. But that tends to happen over time.
And then, so I'm emailing initially, and maybe I will follow up on other channels, but am I emailing, attaching the press release or images? And like, just at what point do I give them the whole thing out the gate, or do I provide a link to the Dropbox with the images, or like?
Right. Yeah. I think it's rare. You'd rarely want to attach anything to a cold email unless you have a prior relationship with the reporter, where some reporters will say, I respect all embargoes, send me all news in advance with the embargo on the press release, and I'll take it and I'll cover it if I think it's worth, or I'll follow up with you if I think it's worth it. Then you can send a PDF. It is, for reasons of caution, when sharing news with a reporter, I think the best practice is to share it as a PDF rather than a doc, which might contain comments and edits. Right. So you don't want to share your working G doc. You don't want to share your Word doc if you still use Word. And if, some clients do. So it's just sort of automatic now for if you're a PR person that if you're sharing news with the media, you make a clean copy, you save it as a PDF and you send it over that way. As for heavier like slide decks and art and whatnot, yeah, I think that the rule there, now that we all have Dropbox or G Drive or Box or whatever, just put it in a media kit that you can link to, and there's really no need to attach it to the email anymore. It's been so long since I was even thinking about attaching big files. I mean, it's been years and years and years because it's so convenient to just link them. But one potential concern is that you'll get caught in spam filters. I don't even know how likely it is, whether spam filters are still tuned, like hyper attuned to that. But by linking out to those assets, at least you don't have to worry about it.
Right. And any tips on timing? Is there a day of the week, a time of the day?
Well, okay. Now, this is really where knowing your reporter is important. As a rule of thumb, you can assume that reporters are writing mid-morning to mid-afternoon. What I've found is that reporters will usually say that the best time to pitch them is first thing in the morning, less commonly in the afternoon, like after deadline. Yeah. I've had success with both approaches. I think the safer one is probably first thing in the morning when the reporter is having their coffee, catching up with the news, seeing if something's breaking that they need to. So they're doing their daily sort of news analysis. Also, a lot of publications have what they call a budget meeting in the morning where the reporters get together either online or in person, depending on the publication, and they'll share what they're working on and pitch it to the editor. That's a more traditional newsroom. Truthfully, I don't know if many of the more bloggy publications still have a formal meeting, but it could be. I know that Forbes, for instance, I've worked with reporters at Forbes who say, this is interesting to me, I need to pitch it tomorrow.
Yeah.
So that's a consideration as well.
Okay. Let's talk about follow-up. We've sent our pitch. It's in. We've heard nothing. We've got to follow up. And this is a part, I feel like, where you can really go wrong and get on the nerves of a reporter. So I send it in. Our announcement's coming up. I mean, how long do I wait?
Right. So what most reporters will say is one follow-up a couple days later is fine. After that, you can assume I'm not interested. They'll say, I read all my mail and I can't respond to every pitch. Keep it to one and give me a couple days after the original pitch. So it is important when you are planning your pitch strategy, your media strategy for a particular announcement, to build in that time for follow-up if you can. I mean, not all stories can wait. Some news that you're pitching is ready on, Monday to pitch for an announcement Wednesday, and that Wednesday is a hard deadline. There's nothing you can do about it. But if possible, if you're pitching ahead of time under embargo or as an exclusive, you want to build in more time for follow-up.
Right. I mean, let's think about the classic funding announcement. I'm aiming for a particular day. I'm pitching, I want to get TechCrunch, and here's the reporter that's most likely to write, and I have to get them under embargo, and I'm pitching this as an exclusive. And I send exclusive, and then we wait, and then I follow up once. I'm going to be like, are you going to take this or we're not? I'm going to be very tempted to follow up again, but you've got to kind of build in that sort of,
right.
You've got to give them a day, maybe they're ill, maybe they're at a conference, maybe they're on another deadline, and, you follow up once. And then there's some value judgment on when do I cut bait on that one and move on to the next reporter because I want to hit but each one needs 24, 48 hours. And I think that process, like that's the art of it in many ways, sort of working out. And maybe they'll even say, yeah, I'd like this. And then you hear nothing.
Now, that is where if the reporter has expressed interest, and this unfortunately happens more often than anyone would like, they'll express interest and then disappear. So you don't know whether you should move on to another reporter or not. And these are some of the hard decisions you make in a pitch, especially with an exclusive. So typically with an exclusive, like if you're not pitching an exclusive, you're pitching to multiple reporters, you pitch once, you follow up, and then you can write them off. They just don't, they're not interested. But with an exclusive, it's actually important, especially if you're pitching other reporters at the same publication, to let them know that you're moving on and to just say, thanks for taking a look. Appreciate your time. I'm going to assume this isn't a fit. Hope to catch you with the next announcement. And then once in a while, that note will actually will get the reporter's attention and they realize, oh yeah, I did want to take a look at that. I don't want to give up this opportunity just yet. Hold on. And then they'll suddenly pop up out of nowhere and say, no, just hang on a sec. Let me take a look at that. Or I can take a look at that. Can I get back to you tomorrow? And then usually you're feeling so, because you're going down the list. So whoever you're pitching is the reporter you want most at that given moment. So as the PR person, you're thinking, fantastic. Okay, sure. Take a day. Great. When sometimes, yes, that process gets drawn out. They say, let me take a look, and then they don't get back to you for a couple of days. It's usually because they're working on a story. And when I can tell you from experience, when as a reporter, you are heads down on a story, it can just be all consuming. You can't really process anything else because you're under so much time pressure and you're fielding so many inputs from so many different places that you just have to triage. And PR is usually first in line to get, if your attention is limited as a reporter, you're going to triage the PR person.
That's fair. And they may, even with the best will in the world, want to cover it, but they didn't have time. They thought they had time, They didn't have time. We can all relate to that.
And I think you asked also about day of the week. And it's just, the day of the week, I think that the best guide is how you would feel yourself. Or, if you're working 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're still acquainted with people who are not that hard charging or who don't have that level of energy. So try to imagine what an average person is like and think, how are they feeling at 4:30 on Friday before a 3-day weekend, right? Probably they're not at their most attentive. Just think like, if a person is coming off the weekend, so Monday and Friday are usually not the absolute best times, either to schedule news or to schedule a pitch, especially Friday. I could talk about any number of pitches where I've been under the gun and I pitched on Friday and it worked out great, or I pitched over the weekend, just a Hail Mary, and it got caught. Sometimes it happens. But again, playing the percentages, just think about when people are fully engaged with their work. It's usually in the core of the week and during the heart of the business hours on the early side. So just a practical consideration for timing a news announcement. The conventional wisdom is you don't schedule a news announcement for Monday or Friday. Friday, because the conventional wisdom is people aren't paying attention, and because when the news gets published, it's going to get lost over the weekend. So your social promotion is not going to have as much impact. People are just less attentive over the next couple of days than they would be if you put your news out on a Tuesday, Wednesday. Tuesday, historically, across I think all sectors of media is considered the prime day for issuing news. Monday is usually avoided in large part because if you have to make adjustments to your launch plan over the weekend, it can be very difficult to dial back whatever you've arranged with reporters ahead of time. If you schedule for Monday and then you realize, oh, I have to push it to Tuesday and we can't have any stories coming out Monday, that can be very difficult to arrange if you or your PR person is trying to get in touch with reporters over the weekend and beg them to move the news to Tuesday, which, to be clear, if you've agreed with them that it's going out Monday, they're under no obligation. Most of the time, they'll respect it if you can get hold of them, but they're actually under no obligation to move the announcement. Once you have a reporter under embargo for a certain date, they have the right to publish on that date. These days, for B2B news, most reporters are not looking to publish ahead of the press release. They don't usually regard your product news as a big killer scoop worth risking the relationship with you for. And, just out of fellow feeling, they generally will be fine if you can reach them. But they've put work in, they've scheduled for a particular day. They think they've filled the news hole for that day. they think, with at least partly with that story. And now if you tell them, well, that's coming out Tuesday, it's not necessarily great for them. So it does damage the relationship, or you risk damaging the relationship if you're moving the news. And so all of which is to say Monday can be a very dicey time to put it out, to put news out if you're pitching in advance.
Yeah. And large public companies often make announcements on a Monday.
That's
Conferences
right.
often start on the Monday. So, they then have big announcements. Like, there's just going to be some traffic. Everyone then pitches on a Tuesday. So then you might think, well, I'll go on a Wednesday. You can really get into the whole sort of game of this. But okay. So let's talk about some common mistakes. When it comes to media pitching, what are the most common mistakes that you see from startups?
Well, by far the most common mistake is to have a mismatch in messaging between what works for customers and what works for reporters. And so the form that usually takes is that startups talk too much about themselves in the pitch. They don't realize that to the reporter, they are not the star of the story. And they use too much customer messaging in the pitch. And that's usually a quick way to turn a reporter off, unless they are a reporter that covers product news and you're pitching a new product, then it's fine. But it can be just hard to break that habit of talking about yourself rather than talking about the industry. So it's knowing what kind of story you're pitching and what aspects of your business are going to be most helpful to the reporter. It's that mismatch that is usually the culprit when I see startups pitch themselves. The other thing that I see is that they're not clear up front with what they are pitching. They're more vague than they need to be or than they should be. Their subject line doesn't stand out. They manage to be both vague and self-promotional. It's just not a winning approach.
Right. You see that, and you see not getting agreement on the embargo. I mean, all these okay, and you've just sort of given all the details. So did they agree to that? Because he's just sort of almost, and it can happen when you know the reporter quite well, and you sort of assume that they're your friend. Oh, well, here you go. And you're like, okay, well, that might all go well, but it might not. So often if an agency did that, it would be sloppy. And so,
I suppose it's worth mentioning just the classic mistake with embargo pitching, which is to send a reporter news and just inform them it's under embargo. You actually have to get agreement to an embargo before you provide the news. It's sort of like being off the record. You can't just say, this is off the record, but it's a blow. You have to ask the reporter, can I tell you something off the record? And then they say yes. This is why PR people generally recommend spokespeople, especially for relatively inexperienced spokespeople, don't even talk off the record because it can get hairy. But similarly, unless a reporter tells you in advance, send me stuff under embargo, you can't just assume they will hold the embargo. You have to say, I have some news under embargo. This is the date. Can you hold the embargo? And if so, I can send you more. And a lot of new founders will just send news under embargo. And it may backfire, it may not, but it's definitely not best practice.
All right, Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Give me an example of a pitch that failed and why.
Yeah, this is actually a really easy question for me to answer because one just really stands out in particular that happened early in my career, and I was pitching a legal AI product. I made the mistake we've talked about a lot on this episode where I was using the marketing language. I was pitching Bloomberg. So top tier tech reporter back when they actually had someone who did just cover the B2B. And I laid out this really complicated rationale for why this technology wasn't just going to change how the legal department functioned, but it was going to make, and I cringe to even speak these words, it was going to make the entire enterprise more nimble and agile. And this reporter got back, he said, you've just described all enterprise software. Right. And that was one of the most, obviously the pitch didn't land, but that response was one of the most useful things a reporter ever said to me, because I realized, what am I doing? I know better than this. Looking at this pitch, how did I ever think this was going to land? But it's so easy in the moment when you have a lot of pitches to get out, and especially if you're a PR person in an agency, you're trying to serve a whole lot of different clients, you just fall back on the boilerplate marketing language.
Yeah.
And of course it didn't land. Of course it wasn't going to work. So that was really a formative moment for me in my career, but also a great example of the principles we've been discussing on this episode.
Brilliant. That's excellent, Chris. I think that sounds like a great note to end on. Thanks for diving deep on this. There's a lot of nuance to media pitching. And I think if you're doing it yourself as a founder, hopefully this will give you the sort of framework of actually how to do it. And even if you're not, and you're a senior exec and you're working with your comms team or an agency, understanding the mechanics of how agencies work, and then how do articles about your company actually appear and what's going to make them appear more often, which is what you want. This is where the rubber meets the road, really. And so that's going to help you sort of frame that out. So that's why we wanted to dive deeply into this. Chris, thanks for that. Really enjoyed that. And thank you all for listening. If that was useful, please follow us, drop us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. We'll see you all again this time next week.